The morning Theodora Marsh signed the papers to acquire Sterling Capital Group, she did it alone, in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor with a view of the Toronto skyline and no one sitting across from her. That was how she preferred things: clean, controlled, quiet. What she didn't know, standing there in her charcoal Loro Piana blazer with her fountain pen still warm from the ink, was that someone in that building had already decided she wouldn't survive the year. Theodora had built Northgate Financial from a two-person advisory firm into one of the most quietly powerful investment houses in the country. She didn't appear on magazine covers. She didn't attend galas unless the charity was one she'd personally vetted. She ran her company the way she ran her mornings, methodically, without sentiment, and always 30 minutes ahead of everyone else. She was 41 years old. She had no husband, no children, and an apartment on St. Clair West that looked, in the words of her assistant Joanna, like a place where feelings go to retire. Theodora had laughed at that. She laughed at a lot of things people said about her, because laughing was faster than explaining. The Sterling acquisition had taken 14 months to close. It doubled Northgate's assets under management and gave her a seat at every table in Bay Street finance that had previously found reasons to keep her standing. What it also gave her, though she didn't know this yet, was a company with a rot in its foundation that someone had been very careful to hide. The elevator that served Northgate's executive floor had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. Joanna had filed 2 service requests with the building. Both had been acknowledged. Neither had been acted on. The elevator ran fine most of the time. Doors opening, floors registering, the soft synthetic voice announcing arrivals, but twice in the past week it had stopped between floors for long enough to make the occupants uncomfortable. Once with Theodora inside. She'd stood in the sudden stillness for 4 minutes, listening to the hum of machinery doing something uncertain somewhere beneath her feet, and then the doors had opened on the wrong floor, and she'd taken the stairs the rest of the way without mentioning it to anyone. The building's maintenance company sent a technician on a Thursday morning in early November. His name was Patrick Coyle, and he arrived with a worn canvas tool bag, a thermos of black coffee, and a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie, who was sitting in the lobby waiting area with a library book and the kind of patience that suggested she'd done this before. Theodora noticed them when she came through the main entrance. The man was signing in at the front desk. The girl was reading with her feet tucked underneath her on the lobby chair, her coat folded precisely beside her like a small adult had taught her to do it. "Who's the kid?" Theodora asked Joanna quietly as they waited for the working elevator. "His daughter. He mentioned his sitter fell through. Building manager approved it. She's not going anywhere." Theodora looked at the girl again. Sophie had looked up from her book and was watching Theodora with frank, unhurried curiosity. The way children watch adults they find genuinely interesting rather than simply loud. Theodora gave her a short nod. Sophie gave one back, then both of them returned to what they were doing. Patrick Coyle spent most of the morning in the elevator shaft. Theodora forgot about him until just after noon when she was walking back from a meeting with Northgate's new Sterlingside directors. 3 men who had joined her board as a condition of the acquisition and who had, in the space of 40 minutes, managed to question her acquisition strategy, her risk framework, and her preferred audit firm in that order, and she found Patrick Coyle standing in the hallway outside the elevator bank with a look on his face that she recognized. It was the look of someone who had found something they didn't expect and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "Miss Marsh," Joanna said behind her, "the technician wanted to." "I can see that." Theodora stopped. "What is it?" Patrick wasn't the kind of man who rushed into sentences. He looked at her for a moment, direct, not rude, and then said, "The cable tension on the secondary break is wrong. Not worn wrong. Set wrong." "Meaning?" "Meaning someone adjusted it. Fairly recently, I'd say. Few weeks, maybe." He paused. "Cable doesn't drift to that position on its own. Someone had to turn a manual override to get it there." The hallway was quiet. Down the corridor, 2 junior analysts were talking about something in low voices. The overhead lights hummed faintly. "Are you telling me the elevator was tampered with?" Theodora asked. Patrick didn't blink. "I'm telling you what I found. What it means is your call." He reached into the front pocket of his canvas bag and produced a small photograph, the kind you took on a phone and printed at a drugstore, of the cable housing with a date stamp in the corner. "I took that this morning before I touched anything. Thought you might want it." Theodora took the photograph. She looked at it for a long moment. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. 11 years. "And you've seen this before? Cable tension set deliberately off?" "Twice," he said. "Once was a landlord trying to slow the elevator so tenants would complain and break their leases. Once was something worse. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to." "Fix it," Theodora said, "and don't discuss what you found with anyone in this building. Bill the full service call to my personal account, not the corporate one." Patrick looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his bag, and went back to work. Theodora stood in the hallway with the photograph in her hand and thought about the fact that she had been alone in that elevator, 4 minutes between floors, 2 weeks ago. She did not call the police, not yet. She called her lawyer instead, a woman named Constance who had been a Crown prosecutor before going private and who had, in Theodora's estimation, the best instincts of anyone she'd ever met for knowing when something was about to become criminal rather than merely unpleasant. They met that evening at Constance's office on University Avenue. Theodora laid out what Patrick had found. Constance listened without interrupting, which was how you knew she was taking it seriously. "Who had access to the maintenance system in the past month?" Constance asked. "That's what I need to find out." "You have a new board." "I'm aware. 3 of your new directors came directly out of Sterling Capital." "Also aware." Constance tapped her pen against the edge of her desk. "Is there anyone inside who might have reason to want the acquisition to fail after closing? Someone who loses power in the new structure?" Theodora thought about it. Not for long. "Renwick," she said. Adrian Renwick had been Sterling Capital's chief investment officer for 9 years. Under the original Sterling structure, he'd been second only to the founder, a man named Graham Sterling who had retired to the Okanagan and sold Theodora the company because none of his 3 adult children had wanted to run it. Renwick had expected to be offered the equivalent position at Northgate. Theodora had declined to create one. His existing role had been absorbed into her existing structure, and he now reported to a woman 6 years his junior who held Theodora's full confidence. He had taken the news professionally. He had thanked her for the meeting and walked out of her office without raising his voice, which she'd noted at the time as the sign of either a very controlled person or a very patient one. "I'll need more than a cable," Constance said. "I know," Theodora stood. "I'm working on it." She told Joanna the elevator was out of service for extended maintenance. She had the stairwell access between floors 39 and 42 quietly restricted so that foot traffic through the executive level required keycard entry. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She started paying attention to the small things. Which meetings Renwick requested access to, which documents he'd pulled from the shared acquisition drive, which members of her newly inherited IT team had been hired in the last 18 months and by whom. It took her 9 days to find the thread, and when she found it, it wasn't where she'd expected. The IT access logs showed that a file package, the full due diligence documentation from Northgate's acquisition review of Sterling, had been exported to an external address 3 days before the acquisition closed. Not during, before. The external address traced to a numbered company registered in Nova Scotia. The numbered company's registered agent was a law firm in Halifax. The law firm had, as one of its senior partners, a man named Gregory Renwick, Adrian Renwick's older brother. Theodora took this to Constance on a Wednesday evening. She also brought Patrick Coyle. She had called Patrick that morning, which had surprised him. She could tell by the pause before he answered. She'd explained briefly what she needed. Not a testimony, not a confrontation, just a clear account of what he'd found and what it meant, delivered to a lawyer who needed to understand the technical details. He'd shown up on time in the same canvas jacket, and Sophie had not been with him. It was a school day. He'd sat across from Constance, answered her questions carefully and without embellishment, and when Constance had pressed him on whether he was certain the adjustment had been intentional, he'd said, "The valve that controls, that override, requires 2 steps and a tool to access. You can't do it by accident. You'd have to know what you were doing and decide to do it." After he left, Constance had sat for a moment and said, "I like him." "He's thorough," Theodora said. "You trust him." "I trust what he found." Constance looked at her over her reading glasses. "That's not what I asked." Theodora said nothing. Constance let it go. All right, here's what we do. What they did was elegant and Theodora felt appropriately ironic. The information package that had been sent to Adrian Renwick's brother's firm had contained the full structural breakdown of how Northgate intended to integrate Sterling's assets, which portfolios would be consolidated, which would be dissolved, which key personnel would be retained. If someone outside were to use that information, they could position themselves ahead of certain market movements. Small ones, nothing that would trigger a regulator on its own, but the kind of incremental advantage that, compounded over months, would add up to something that most certainly would. Constance contacted the OSC, the Ontario Securities Commission, quietly through a channel that bypassed the standard intake process. She provided the access logs, the export record, the connection to the numbered company, and a brief chronology that Patrick had helped her construct around the elevator maintenance timeline. Then she and Theodora did nothing. They waited. Renwick didn't know what was coming. He continued attending board meetings. He continued seeing himself on communications he had marginal relevance to. He continued, as Theodora had come to observe, doing the thing that people do when they believe they are smarter than the person they're working against. He stopped being careful. He sent 2 more document packages to the Nova Scotia address in the next 3 weeks. Both were logged automatically by the monitoring system Constance had quietly arranged through the company's external IT security firm, a firm that Renwick had not hired, and whose existence in Northgate's infrastructure he apparently hadn't discovered. On a Tuesday morning in December, 2 OSC investigators arrived at the 42nd floor. Theodora met them at the elevator, the repaired elevator, and walked them to the boardroom herself. She had not told the board this was happening. She had told Constance, and she had told Joanna, and she had sent Patrick a text message the evening before that said only, "It worked. Thank you." He'd replied after a few minutes, "Good." Then, after another pause, Sophie asks if you like hockey. Theodora had looked at that message for a long moment, standing in her apartment with the city lights spread out behind her through the window. Then she'd typed back, "Tell her I'm learning." The board meeting that followed was the shortest in Northgate Financial's history. Renwick had been escorted from the building before 9 in the morning. By 10, Theodora was standing at the head of the boardroom table. The long one, with the view of the lake, and the remaining directors were looking at her with an expression she had seen before and had learned to read accurately. It was the expression of people recalibrating. She didn't make a speech. She laid out the facts in order, without drama, the access logs, the export, the connection, the OSC involvement, the elevator, last. When she mentioned the elevator, one of the Sterling side directors, a man named Forsyth, who had been the most pointed in his early questioning of her decisions, went very still. "The elevator," he repeated. "The secondary brake cable," Theodora said. "Adjusted manually. Approximately 3 weeks before the first service report. Our technician documented it on the morning he found it." She slid the photograph across the table, the one Patrick had printed at the drugstore, with the date stamp in the corner. "I've been waiting to see whether Mr. Renwick would make additional moves before I brought this to the table. He did." Forsyth picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. "The technician," he said. "Is he—" "Credible," Theodora said. "Completely. 11 years of service work. Clean record. No connection to Northgate prior to the maintenance call." She paused. "He also had the presence of mind to document what he found before he fixed it, without being asked." Forsyth set the photograph down. The vote to refer the full matter to Northgate's legal counsel and cooperate with the OSC investigation was unanimous. It took 4 minutes. Afterward, standing at the window while the directors filed out, Joanna appeared at her elbow. "You're not celebrating," Joanna observed. "I'm not a celebrator. You could make an exception." Theodora looked at the lake. It was the color of pewter in December, flat and wide and indifferent. She had always liked it. "Schedule me a meeting with the building maintenance manager," she said. "I want to formalize a service contract, specifically with the technician who came in November, Coyle." Joanna made a note. "Just the elevator work?" "Building-wide inspection, full scope. Tell them I want him specifically." She paused. "He notices things." Joanna nodded and left. Theodora remained at the window a moment longer. She thought about the photograph. She thought about a 7-year-old girl sitting in a lobby chair with her coat folded beside her. reading a library book with the patience of someone who understood that the adults in her life were doing important things, and that waiting was sometimes what you did for the people you trusted. She thought about what she'd said in that text message. I'm learning. She hadn't been talking about hockey. The building inspection took 3 days. Patrick and a colleague worked floor by floor, and Theodora made a point of being present for the findings briefing at the end of each day, which was unusual enough that Joanna had started leaving a pot of coffee in the small meeting room off the executive corridor without being asked. Patrick delivered his findings the same way he delivered everything, directly, without padding. Worn fire door seals on floors 30 through 34. A water pressure issue in the service bathroom on 28 that suggested a slow leak somewhere in the wall. A ventilation damper on the mechanical level that was stuck in a partially closed position, which he suspected had been that way for several years. Nothing as serious as the elevator, but nothing that should have been missed either. How did this building get signed off with these? Theodora asked on the second day. Patrick considered. Either the original inspection was rushed, or whoever certified it didn't know what they were looking at, or was paid not to look. He looked at her. That happens. I know it does. They stood in the mechanical room, surrounded by the low industrial noise of the building's systems working. It was warmer than the rest of the floors, and the light was harsher, and Theodora was aware that she was entirely out of her context down here in a way she almost never was anywhere. How does your daughter feel about you working late this week? She said. It came out more directly than she'd intended. Patrick glanced at her, not surprised exactly, but attentive. She's with my sister. She's fine. He paused. Sophie's adaptable. She seems like it. She is. A small pause. She also keeps asking whether the building lady is going to come to her school's science fair. Theodora blinked. I'm sorry? She mentioned you looked like someone who would like science fairs. He said it with a completely neutral expression, though something at the corner of his mouth suggested he was not entirely neutral. I told her that was probably not realistic. Theodora thought about it for a moment. She had not been to a child's school event in her adult life. She had approximately no model for how that would work. When is it? She said. Patrick looked at her properly then. February. I'll put it in my calendar. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, she'll ask me tonight if you actually will. Tell her yes. He nodded once. They went back to the inspection. The OSC investigation concluded in February. Adrian Renwick was charged with breach of securities regulation and unauthorized disclosure of material non-public information. His brother's firm in Halifax was placed under separate review. The case was not high profile in the way that Bay Street scandals sometimes were. No front-page photographs, no breathless cable coverage. But it was thorough, and the outcome was not in doubt. Theodora gave one statement to a financial publication. It was 8 sentences long. She thanked her legal team, noted that Northgate Financial's internal systems had performed as designed, and said that she looked forward to a straightforward year ahead. She did not mention Patrick Coyle. She did, however, restructure the facilities management contract for the building. The new agreement specified an ongoing consulting role for the maintenance work, with expanded scope and a 6-month review clause. It was a formal arrangement, properly papered, with nothing in it that required any particular interpretation. Patrick had read through the contract in her office, sitting across from her desk with Sophie waiting in the lobby again. It was a professional development day at the school, and the sitter situation had, apparently, remained unreliable. This is more than a standard maintenance contract, he said. The scope is broader than standard. It's also significantly higher compensation. The work is worth it. She looked at him. You documented something that you had no obligation to document. You preserved evidence before anyone asked you to, and you were discreet when discretion mattered. That's not standard either. Patrick looked at the contract for another moment. I have a business to run. I know, this doesn't change that. It adds to it. She paused. Your call. He signed the contract. He capped the pen and set it on her desk, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Outside her window, February had settled over the city with a gray and particular stubbornness, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself loudly but simply remained. Sophie's project won second place, he said. I know. I was there. You stood in the back. I didn't want to be a distraction. She saw you. I know, Theodora said. She waved. She had waved back, briefly, from the doorway of a school gymnasium in the West End, in her charcoal coat, with a paper cup of terrible coffee that a volunteer parent had pressed into her hand, watching a 7-year-old explain the water cycle to a cluster of judges with the same unhurried confidence she'd shown reading her library book in a lobby chair 3 months earlier. It had been, Theodora thought, one of the better February afternoons she could remember. She didn't say that out loud, but she thought Patrick probably knew it anyway, because he was, as she had established, a person who noticed things. Same time next week for the mechanical level follow-up, he said. Wednesday, she said. He stood, picked up his bag, and walked to her office door. He stopped there for a moment, not turning around. Thank you, he said, for the contract and the other thing. The other thing, she repeated, telling her yes. He left. The elevator doors opened and closed down the hall, smooth and quiet and exactly as they should be. Theodora turned back to her desk. Outside, the lake was there below the skyline, flat and wide and pewter gray. She had always liked it. She opened her calendar and blocked out an hour on Saturday morning. No title, just the time, held. Some things didn't need a label yet. They just needed space. I keep thinking about that photograph. The one Patrick printed at a drugstore, with the date stamp in the corner. A small, ordinary piece of paper that ended up dismantling something that had taken months to build in the dark. There's a version of this story where Theodora never finds out, where the elevator fails on the right day, at the right moment, and the question of what happened to Northgate Financial becomes someone else's retrospective. That version exists. It almost happened. What prevented it wasn't luck, exactly. It was the fact that one person, a man with a canvas tool bag and a daughter waiting downstairs, decided that what he found mattered, and that documenting it was the right thing to do before anyone asked him to. I think about that a lot. We talk about integrity like it's a grand gesture, something you perform when people are watching. But what Patrick did, he did alone, in an elevator shaft, with no one there to see it. He took the photograph because it was the honest thing to do. Full stop. No audience, no reward, no guarantee that anyone would ever care. That's what integrity actually looks like when you strip away the speeches. It's just a quiet decision made in a small space, when the outcome is still completely uncertain. And Theodora, she could have called the police the moment Patrick told her what he found. She could have made noise, made it public, moved fast out of fear or anger. Instead, she waited, she thought. She built a case the way you build anything that has to hold, carefully, from the foundation up, without rushing the parts that needed time. That kind of patience isn't passive. It's one of the hardest things I know of, sitting with what you know and choosing the right moment, rather than the satisfying one. It takes a particular kind of mind to do that under pressure. The kind that doesn't confuse urgency with panic. And then there's the resilience of it, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that gets written up anywhere. Just the ongoing, quiet decision to keep functioning while something enormous is happening underneath the surface. Theodora ran board meetings and signed documents and had her morning coffee and answered her emails while an OSC investigation was quietly taking shape in the background. She didn't fall apart. She didn't need anyone to know how hard it was. She just kept going, because that's what the situation required. I think those three things, the honesty to do right when no one's watching, the intelligence to act carefully rather than just quickly, and the steadiness to keep standing up under weight, those are the things that actually determine how a story ends. Not status, not connections, not the corner office. Adrian Renwick had all of those and still lost, because he assumed that being in a position of power meant he was the smartest person in the room. He wasn't. He was just the loudest. Sophie asked if the building lady would come to her science fair. Theodora blocked an hour on a Saturday in February and stood in the back of a gymnasium with terrible coffee and didn't announce herself to anyone. That detail stays with me, because I think the person you are in the small moments, the unrequired ones, the ones where no one is keeping score, that person is who you actually are. And who you actually are is, eventually, what everything else comes down to.